Part 1. The Woman Who Came Instead. The letter was not addressed to her. Maren Alderman knew that before she even touched it. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope, the careful loops of the postal clerk in Greystone Creek, Colorado territory, and she knew without opening it that whatever was inside belonged to her sister. Everything always belonged to Violet first. She set it on the kitchen table beside the bread dough she had been working since before sunrise. Her hands were coated in flour, rough at the knuckles, and she wiped them on her apron with the methodical patience of a woman who had learned long ago that hurrying never changed the outcome of anything. The letter would say what it said whether she read it now or in an hour. She read it now. Violet was gone. Maren stood at the kitchen table in the gray Indiana morning and read the letter 3 times, not because the words were difficult, because she needed her mind to catch up with what her eyes were telling her. The handwriting was Violet's, small and careful, the penmanship of a girl who had been praised for her letters since the age of 7, while Maren sat beside her at the same table producing what their schoolteacher had once called serviceable but unlovely script. Even in the farewell note, Violet's handwriting was prettier than Maren's. The words themselves were simple enough. By the time you read this, I will be Mrs. Chester Bloom. I know what you will say. I know what everyone will say. But I cannot go to Colorado and marry men. I have never seen men who live in the wilderness, like it is still 1830, men who have nothing to offer but land and silence and the kind of life that would make me old before I am 30. Chester has a house in the city. Chester has a future that looks like something I can recognize. I am sorry about the money. I am sorry about Mr. Holt and his brothers, but surely they will find someone else. Men like that always find someone. Do not hate me, Maren. I am just choosing the life I want instead of the one that was chosen for me. Your sister Violet. Maren folded the letter precisely along its original creases and set it back on the table. Then she stood very still for a moment, looking at the stagecoach ticket that had been left beside it. Paid in full. One passage from Lafayette, Indiana to Greystone Creek, Colorado territory, departing in 2 days. The name on the ticket was Alderman, which was technically her name too. She heard her father before she saw him. The sound of George Alderman moving through the house was the sound of a man carrying more weight than his frame was built, for each step slightly heavier than it needed to be, the floorboards registering his passage like a quiet record of everything that had gone wrong. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at his eldest daughter, and then at the letter on the table, and something in his face went very quiet. "She's gone," Maren said. It was not a question. George Alderman sat down in his chair at the head of the table. He had been sitting in that chair for 60 years, through harvests and failures, and the deaths of 2 children and 1 wife, and a war that had taken boys from every farm within 20 miles. He sat down in it now, and placed both hands flat on the table, and looked at the letter without reading it. "The money," he said, "already spent." He closed his eyes. The $55 that Caleb Holt had sent to cover the cost of Violet's passage and preparation had arrived 3 months ago and had disappeared into the mouth of the farm's debts within a week. Seed, back taxes, the medicine that kept George's heart beating at a reasonable pace. The money was gone the way all money went, on a farm that had been losing the argument with the land for the better part of a decade. "We cannot pay it back," George said. "No. If he demands it returned, we lose the North Field, maybe more." Her father opened his eyes. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with a kind of tired respect that was different from the way he looked at Violet, less tender and more reliant, the look a man gives the person he actually depends on, rather than the person he simply loves. "What do we do?" Maren looked at the stagecoach ticket. She had already done the arithmetic. She had been doing arithmetic her whole life, quietly, in the margins of other people's conversations, calculating the gap between what was hoped for and what was actually possible. It was not a talent anyone had noticed in particular. Violet had been the one people noticed. "Someone has to go," she said. George stared at her. "The ticket is valid for any alderman." I looked at the language when it arrived. He specified the name, not the person. She picked up the ticket and examined it with the careful attention she gave all documents. "He sent for a wife. He does not know what Violet looks like. He has never met her. He corresponded with a woman he imagined based on letters she wrote him." Marin. "I will tell him the truth the moment I arrive. I will not deceive him. I will explain exactly what happened and give him the choice to send me away." She set the ticket down. "But if someone does not go, we have taken $55 from a man who did nothing wrong and given him nothing in return. That is theft, Papa. I will not have us be thieves." Her father looked at her for a long time. Outside, the Indiana morning was doing what Indiana mornings did in early March, producing a thin gray light that illuminated nothing particularly well and made everything look like it was still deciding whether to exist. "You know what you look like," George said finally, not cruelly, simply. Marin felt the words the way she had learned to feel them, as information rather than injury. She was 28 years old. She was not small. She was not delicate. She had none of her sister's golden quality, none of the lightness that made people want to be near Violet the way they wanted to be near a fire in winter. Marin was built for work and had been built for it her whole life, and the work had left marks on her hands and her posture and the careful economy of her expressions. She knew exactly what she looked like. "I know," she said. "I also know what I can do, and I am hoping those are two different things." Her mother found them 20 minutes later. Edna Alderman read the letter standing up, which was how she read all difficult things, as though sitting down would make whatever was written more permanent. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Marin with an expression that contained several things at once: grief and guilt, and something that might have been relief. The relief of a woman who has watched her plain daughter go unnoticed for 28 years and is now watching that daughter volunteer to walk into a situation most people would run from. "They asked for Violet," Edna said. "They asked for a wife. Violet was the candidate. The position is still open. Marin, you cannot simply—" "What is the alternative?" Marin's voice was even. She had practiced evenness for years. "We write a letter apologizing and watch Papa lose the farm. We send the ticket back unused and pray that Caleb Holt is a forgiving man. Or I go, I explain, and I give him the chance to decide for himself." Her mother looked at the ticket. Then she looked at her daughter for a long time, really looked in the way mothers sometimes do when they are trying to see their children clearly instead of through the lens of love and familiarity and accumulated assumption. "He may send you away the moment he sees you," Edna said. "He may." Marin picked up the ticket and folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of her apron. "But he cannot send me away before I get there." She went to pack her bag before she could think about it long enough to change her mind. The stagecoach left Lafayette at first light on a Tuesday, and Marin Alderman sat in the back corner with her single traveling bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and watched Indiana disappear behind her with the expression of a woman filing information rather than experiencing sentiment. She had 3 days of travel ahead of her before she reached Greystone Creek. She intended to use them. In her bag, carefully folded and organized in the order in which they had been received, were 8 months of correspondence between the Holt household and her sister Violet. She had read them all before leaving, in the 3 hours between her decision and her departure, reading with the focused attention she brought to any document that contained information she needed. The letters told her things that Violet had never mentioned aloud. There were 3 men living on the land outside Greystone Creek, not one. Violet had mentioned this at dinner once, reading from a letter with a theatrical shudder that had made their mother laugh. 3 men sharing a cabin like it was perfectly normal, Like the wilderness had its own rules about how many people constituted a household. Their mother had thought it was charming. Maren had filed it and waited for more information. She had more information now. Clem Holt was the one who wrote most often. The handwriting was vigorous and slightly uncontrolled, the letters of a man who had things to say and was not entirely sure how to contain them in the available space. He described the cabin he had built in detail that bordered on love. Each room explained with the pride of a craftsman. Each addition noted with the satisfaction of someone who measures progress in wood and nails and the solid physical fact of walls that keep out the wind. He was funny in the way that men are funny when they are not trying to be accidentally through the gap between what they mean to say and what actually comes out. He wanted a family. He said so plainly without embarrassment, which Maren noted as either exceptional honesty or exceptional naivety and reserved judgment. Rowan Holt wrote twice. The first letter was long and formal, the writing of a man who had composed it carefully and revised it more than once, describing the land and the life with an accuracy that bordered on warning. The winters were hard. The isolation was real. The work was physical and unrelenting. He wrote about his brother William killed in a fire 5 years ago briefly, and without elaboration, the way people mention things they have decided not to discuss, but feel obligated to acknowledge. His second letter was a single paragraph, 3 sentences. He said that the spring had come early this year. He said the creek was running well. He said he hoped she was well. That was all. Maren had read that letter 4 times. There was something in the compression of it, the way an entire interior life was visible in the gaps between those 3 careful sentences that told her more about Rowan Holt than his brother's pages of enthusiastic description. The third man, Weston Cross, had not written a single letter, but Clem mentioned him in every one he sent casually, the way you mention the weather or the state of the roads, as though it would be strange not to include him, as though he was simply a fact of the landscape. Weston had said this. Weston had done that. Weston had looked at the sky yesterday and predicted rain and been right. Weston Cross appeared in Clem's letters the way mountains appear on the horizon, always present, never explained. Maren had noted all of this in her small leather notebook, the one she carried everywhere, and which her father had always called her ledger, though it contained far more than accounts. She wrote observations the way an accountant writes numbers, precisely without sentiment, with the understanding that data collected carefully is the only reliable foundation for any decision. She was still writing when the woman across the aisle spoke to her. "First time west." Maren looked up. The woman was perhaps 65, dressed in good clothes that had seen several years of travel with the quality of someone who has stopped being surprised by the world without having stopped being interested in it. She had introduced herself at the Lafayette Depot as Adelaide Marsh widow traveling to see her son in Denver. "Yes," Maren said, running from something or toward something. Maren considered this with genuine attention. "Toward something, I think, though toward something I'm not certain of." Adelaide Marsh looked at the notebook on Maren's lap, at the careful handwriting covering the open page, at the way Maren's pen was still poised above it as though she had only paused mid-thought. "What are you writing?" "Notes," Maren said, "about people I haven't met yet." Adelaide smiled at that, a slow and appreciating smile. "My husband used to say that the best way to understand a person is to pay attention before you meet them. He meant it as advice for business. I think you mean it as something else." "I need to understand 3 men who have been corresponding with someone who is not me," Maren said. She saw no reason to be anything other than direct. "I am going to arrive in their town in 3 days and introduce myself as the wrong sister. I would prefer to have some understanding of what I am walking into." Adelaide Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was a mail-order bride, 1832. He was in Missouri, and I was in Pennsylvania, and we wrote letters for 6 months before I made the trip." She looked out the window at the flat countryside moving past. "He was not what I expected. I was not what he expected. We were married for 38 years. Marin waited. "The question is not whether you are what they wanted," Adelaide said. "The question is whether you are what they need, and whether they are what you need. That is a different calculation entirely." Marin wrote that in her notebook. Not the words exactly, but the shape of the idea, the mathematical form of it: need versus want, present reality versus anticipated fantasy. She was still thinking about it when Adelaide Marsh fell asleep against the window, and the Indiana landscape gave way to the flat immensity of the Central Plains, and the sky became something she had not known sky could be: enormous, indifferent, larger than any sky she had seen from the contained and familiar geography of Indiana farmland. She had never felt so small. She found to her own surprise that she did not entirely mind. Greystone Creek appeared on the fourth morning as a collection of rooftops in a valley cupped between mountain slopes, and Marin pressed her face to the window like a child for exactly 2 seconds before she remembered herself and sat back and smoothed her dress and looked at her notebook instead. The town was small. 8 buildings on the main street, another dozen scattered outward, a general store that doubled as the post office, a church with a weather vane shaped like a rooster, a blacksmith's with smoke rising from its chimney even at this hour. The mountains behind it were not mountains, the way she had imagined mountains, not the modest hills she had seen in illustrations, but something else entirely, something vast and indifferent and covered at their peaks with snow that apparently never fully left even in summer. The stagecoach stopped in front of the post office. The driver climbed down and began unloading luggage from the rack, and Marin sat for one extra moment in the relative shelter of the coach before she made herself stand and gather her bag and step out into the cold mountain air that smelled of pine and wood smoke, and something she could not name, something clean and wild and completely unlike Indiana. She saw them immediately. 3 men standing beside a wagon loaded with supplies, positioned in the loose arrangement of people who have been waiting long enough to settle into it. She knew them without introduction, not from any particular feature she had read about, but from the configuration of them, the way they stood in relation to each other, the spatial grammar of people who know each other very well. The tallest one was already looking at her. He stood apart from the other 2 by a half-step, not aggressively, but naturally the way a man stands when he is accustomed to being the point of reference in any group. His hair was dark with early gray at the temples, and his face was weathered in the way of men who spend most of their life outdoors, not worn out, but marked the features sharpened by years of wind and sun and cold. His hands were visible at his sides, and she could see even at this distance the difference between his left hand and his right, the left. Normal, the right carrying the unmistakable texture of old burn scarring. Rowan Holt. She was certain of it without knowing why she was certain. The man beside him, broader and shorter, and with reddish-brown hair that caught the morning light, had a face built for smiling, the face of someone for whom cheerfulness is a default position rather than an occasional condition. He was looking at the stagecoach with the expression of someone expecting good news, and when Marin stepped down, he looked at her, and the expression did something complicated, not unkind, but confused, the confusion of a man whose mental image has just been replaced by a reality it does not match. Clem Holt, almost certainly. The third man stood slightly apart from both of them, as though the distance was something he maintained by preference rather than circumstance. He was watching her with the complete stillness of someone who has learned to be unobtrusive, not because he lacked presence, but because he had learned how to contain it. His eyes were the first thing she noticed, and the last thing she would have been able to describe, not because they were unusual, but because they were simply awake in a way that made the activity of most other people's eyes look like sleep. Weston Cross. She was sure. She walked toward them. She was aware of exactly what she looked like walking toward them. She had been aware of what she looked like her entire life with the clarity of someone who has never had the option of illusion. She was not small. She was not graceful. She walked the way she did everything with the deliberate forward movement of a person who has somewhere to be and intends to get there. Her dress was her best, which was not saying much, a dark blue wool that was practical rather than beautiful, made by her own hands 3 winters ago from the most durable fabric she could afford. She stopped 2 feet from Rowan Holt and looked at him directly. "Mr. Holt," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the only voice she had ever learned to use. He stared at her, not rudely but openly, the stare of a man trying to understand something his mind has not yet organized. "My name is Maren Alderman. I am Violet's older sister." She said it clearly and continued before the silence could settle into something she would have to fight her way through. "I need to tell you something, and I would appreciate you letting me finish before you respond." Something shifted in his expression. He did not speak. Neither did his brother or his friend. Even Clem, who she had already correctly identified as someone who filled silence instinctively, went quiet. "Violet married Chester Bloom 3 days before her departure date. She left a letter. She is not coming." Maren kept her eyes on Rowan's face and watched him process this with the efficient attention she might have given a calculation she needed to check twice. "The $55 you sent for her passage was used by my family for necessities we could not have afforded otherwise. We cannot repay it. I am aware that makes us responsible for a debt we have no means to settle in money." She paused. "So I came to settle it the only way I could. I am not Violet. I have no intention of pretending to be her. I am 28 years old. I am not delicate. I have no particular beauty, and I am entirely aware of that fact. And I am standing in front of you because my family does not steal from people even accidentally." She looked at all 3 of them once briefly, then back to Rowan. "If you want me to leave, I will find work in this town and send money home when I can. If you want to give me a chance to demonstrate that I am worth something to your household, I am prepared to do that. But I will not deceive you, and I will not pretend this situation is something other than what it is." The silence that followed lasted long enough for her to count 8 full seconds. Clem was the one who broke it. "Can you cook?" he asked. It was such a perfectly Clem question delivered with such genuine earnestness that Maren felt something she had not expected to feel standing in the dusty main street of Greystone Creek, Colorado Territory at 8 in the morning after 4 days of stagecoach travel. She felt the beginning of something that might in time become amusement. "Better than anyone within 50 miles of where we're standing," she said. Clem turned to Rowan. "Rowan?" "I heard her." Rowan's voice was low and even, and she could not read it. He was still looking at her with that focused, unreadable attention. "Give me a moment." "Take whatever time you need," Maren said. "I will be here." The 3 men moved a few steps away and spoke in low voices. Maren turned and looked at the mountains because it was a reasonable thing to do, and also because she could hear most of what they said from where she stood, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Clem said, "She walked off a stagecoach and told us the whole truth before we could even ask a question. That's not nothing." Rowan said, "That's desperation." Weston, after a pause that contained the quality of someone choosing their words with great care, said, "Desperate people lie. They make themselves smaller. They tell you what you want to hear. She didn't do any of those things." A silence. Clem, "Weston's right." Rowan, "Weston's always right. That's not the point." Weston, "Then what is the point?" Another silence, longer this time. Rowan turned and walked back to where Maren stood looking at the mountains. 6 weeks, he said. Not a month. 6 weeks because there are 3 of us, and decisions that involve 3 people require more time than decisions that involve 1. He said it without apology, as though the arithmetic of it was simply obvious. At the end of 6 weeks, if either side wants to end the arrangement, we end it. I will bring you back to Greystone Creek and help you find respectable work. If we all agree to continue, we continue, and we formalize it properly. Formally meaning marriage, Marin said. Formally meaning whatever we agree it means. But yes. She looked at him for a moment. Then at Clem, who was watching her with the hopeful expression of someone who has already decided what he wants the answer to be. Then at Weston, who was watching her with nothing readable at all, which she had already noted was its own kind of expression. My terms, she said. Private room with a working lock. And I want an honest answer to one question before I agree to anything. Rowan waited. Which of you actually wants a wife, and which of you wants a housekeeper? Clem's hand went up immediately with the guileless enthusiasm of a man who has never found his own feelings embarrassing. I want a wife. Weston did not raise his hand. He looked at her with those awake, unreadable eyes and said nothing. But he did not look away. Rowan said, That is a question I cannot answer yet. That, Marin said, is at least honest. She picked up her bag. 6 weeks. I agree to your terms. The wagon is around the corner, Rowan said. He reached for her bag without asking and was already walking before she could respond. She followed him. Behind her, she heard Clem say something to Weston in a low voice and heard Weston's response 3 words quiet as a door closing gently. I know. Me too. She did not look back. The cabin was 14 miles up the mountain road, which was not so much a road as an intention applied to rough ground, the kind of track that would have been impassable to anything but a well-seasoned wagon and drivers who knew every rut by memory. Marin sat on the bench beside Rowan, while Clem and Weston rode behind on horseback, and she watched the landscape change as they climbed the flat certainty of the valley, giving way to something older and more complicated pine forest, closing around them on both sides, the sound of the town disappearing behind them like a voice that had been speaking and simply stopped. Rowan drove with the economy of a man who has done something 10,000 times and no longer needs to think about it. He did not attempt conversation. She did not force it. But after perhaps 20 minutes of silence, she said, How long have the 3 of you been on this land? He kept his eyes on the road. 7 years. Came up from Kansas in '67. Clem and I first, then Weston joined us the following spring. After the war. A slight pause. After the war. The fire that killed your brother, she said. 1869 from your letter. He glanced at her, then the first time he had looked at her since they left town. It was a measuring look, not unfriendly, but assessing the look of a man recalibrating something. You read our letters. All of them, before I left Indiana. She met his look without flinching. I told you I would not deceive you. That includes letting you believe I am arriving unprepared. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, William was 26. I was at the tavern in town. I had been drinking since the afternoon. He said it the way he had written about it in his letter briefly, and without elaboration, the practiced terseness of a man who has decided exactly how much of this story belongs to other people. By the time I got back, there was nothing left to do. Marin did not say she was sorry because she had noticed that sorry was often what people said when they did not know what else to say, and she preferred silence to filler. She said, Is that why you will not sell the land? He looked at her again. Longer this time. William helped build it, he said. If I sell, I have nothing left of him. She wrote that in the column of her mind that she kept for things that explained other things. Rowan Holt was not difficult because he was cold. He was difficult because he was loyal even to ghosts, even at cost to himself. That was something she understood. She had been loyal to her family at cost to herself for 28 years. "The man who keeps asking to buy your land," she said. "Grant McAllister. You know that name." Clem mentioned it in his April letter, said he had been to the property twice with an offer and been refused twice, and seemed to find this surprising. She paused. Men who are surprised to be told no are usually accustomed to getting yes. That makes them persistent in ways that can become dangerous. Rowan looked at her for the third time, and this time the look lasted long enough that she became aware he was revising something, some initial assessment he had made, standing at the depot, that he was now finding insufficient. He did not say anything, but he did not look away quite as quickly as he had before. The cabin appeared when the last light of the afternoon was going horizontal through the trees, turning everything the color of old copper. It was larger than she had expected. Not grand, nothing about it was grand, but solid in the way of a structure that has been built by someone who cared whether it stood up. The logs were tight and even. The roof was in good repair. A covered porch ran along the front with 2 chairs that had the worn look of actual use. A boy appeared in the doorway as the wagon rolled into the yard. 17 maybe, with a face that had not yet decided what it was going to be when it settled, still carrying the unfinished quality of youth. He looked at the wagon, then at Rowan, then at Marin, and the sequence of emotions across his face was so transparent it was almost comic recognition, confusion, recalibration. "That's not Violet," he said. "Correct," Clem said, dismounting with the easy movement of someone who has done it 10,000 times. "This is Miss Marin. She's going to be staying with us for a while. Marin, this is Nash Price. He's been with us 2 years. Nash Price looked at her with the open assessment of someone who has not yet learned to disguise his curiosity as something more socially acceptable. Then he looked at Rowan, then back at Marin. "Is she the new—" "She is a guest," Rowan said, climbing down from the wagon. "Help me unload these supplies." Nash moved to comply, but not before Marin caught the look he exchanged with Clem, a look that contained a question Clem answered with a small shrug and a shake of his head that meant something like later. Marin stood in the yard for a moment before she went inside. She looked at the cabin, at the mountains behind it going dark at their peaks, at the stars that were already appearing in the eastern sky with a clarity and density that simply did not exist at the latitude she had come from. She had never seen stars like that. She had not known they were possible. She picked up her bag and went inside. The interior of the cabin was exactly what she had expected, and worse than she had expected simultaneously. It was functional in the way of a space occupied by people who care about function and have decided consciously or unconsciously that anything beyond function is a problem for someone else. The floor had been swept at some point within recent memory, but not recently enough. The kitchen shelves held supplies organized in a system that she could see had once been logical and had since been subject to years of expedient modification. A layer of grease had established itself on the stove with the confidence of a permanent resident. "Sorry about the state of it," Nash said, appearing behind her with her bag, which he had retrieved from where she had set it on the porch. "We weren't exactly expecting company." "It's fine," she said in the tone that means it is not entirely fine, but that she understands whose responsibility it is and is not inclined to make anyone feel worse about it than necessary. Nash showed her to a small room at the end of the hall, a bed, a dresser, a window without curtains. He brought her 2 blankets and told her the outhouse was 40 feet from the back door and to watch her step on the porch boards because the second one from the left was soft. Then he lingered in the doorway in the way of someone who has questions and has not yet decided whether to ask them. "I'm glad you came," he said finally, "even if you're not who we were expecting." He glanced down the hall in the direction of the kitchen, where she could hear the low voices of the 3 men and the sounds of supper being improvised. "Rowan doesn't say much about it." But I know he's been lonely. All three of them have been. I guess I have too. He disappeared before she could respond. Marin sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the cabin settle around her. She could hear the men in the kitchen, their voices too low to make out words, the occasional sound of something being moved or set down. Outside the window, the mountains were fully dark now, enormous and silent, and the stars were doing the thing she had noticed earlier, multiplying past the point where she had believed stars could multiply, filling the sky with a density of light that made the word sky feel suddenly inadequate. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote, Rowan Holt. Carries guilt. The way some men carry religion quietly constantly as the organizing principle of everything else. Does not believe he deserves the things he wants. This will be the most important thing about him. She wrote Clem Holt, wants connection more than he knows how to say, builds things because building is the language he has, will be the easiest and must not be underestimated for it. She wrote Weston Cross, observes before acting, has learned caution the hard way, said 2 words to me at the depot that told me more than Clem's 8 months of letters. She paused. Then she wrote, the boy Nash told the truth about 3 men and himself without being asked, and without realizing he was doing it. Note this. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag. In the kitchen, the sound of supper preparation had given way to the sound of supper itself, and then to voices. And after a while, Nash appeared at her door to tell her food was ready. She went to the kitchen and set her notebook on the chair beside her and sat down at the table with 3 men she had met 3 hours ago and a boy who had the honest face of someone who had not yet learned to hide what he felt. They had made something that was technically food. Beans cooked with salt pork bread that had gone stiff, coffee that had been kept hot so long it had become something between coffee and coal. Marin ate what was in front of her without comment. Then she stood up, cleared her plate, and said, Where is the flour? Clem pointed to the shelf. She was quiet for 20 minutes. She had no ambitions of a proper meal at this hour with these ingredients, but she had spent 28 years making something out of very little, and she had not forgotten how. What she produced was simpler than simple cornbread baked fast in the iron skillet, sweet enough to be worth eating, hot enough to matter. She set it on the table. Nash ate his piece in approximately 4 seconds and looked at the remaining cornbread with the expression of someone trying to calculate whether asking for more would be considered rude. Clem said, I haven't had cornbread like that in 2 years, with a directness of feeling that required no further qualification. Rowan said nothing. He ate his piece with the same methodical attention he seemed to bring to everything, and she watched him from the corner of her eye and saw him glance at her twice with an expression she could not yet name. Weston ate the least of any of them, but before he pushed back his chair to stand, he looked at her across the table for a moment, quiet and direct, and said 2 words. Thank you. Just that. No elaboration. Nash leaned over to her after Weston had gone and said in a stage whisper that she suspected was entirely intentional. He hasn't said thank you to anyone for 8 months, except when he absolutely has to, just so you know. Marin looked in the direction Weston had gone and said nothing. Later, alone in her room with the door locked as promised, she lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds the cabin made at night, the settling of the logs, the distant low of cattle somewhere beyond the dark, the wind coming down off the mountain with a cold and particular voice. She had done it. She had actually done this impossible, necessary thing. She thought about Violet in Chester Bloom's city house, warm and comfortable, and precisely where she had chosen to be. She did not hate her sister. She understood her sister. Violet had chosen the life she could see over the life she could not, which was what most people did, which was a reasonable and human thing to do. But Marin had spent 28 years being the one who stayed while other people chose what they could see. She had stayed in Indiana while the world moved. She had stayed in her father's books while Violet moved through rooms, leaving light behind her. She had been practical and reliable and useful in all the invisible ways that useful people are useful, and she had watched it add up to very little in the currency that seemed to matter to most people. This, whatever this was the first thing she had chosen for herself. She opened her notebook in the dark, not to write, just to hold it. A habit. 6 weeks. She closed her eyes and listened to the mountain wind and thought about the way Weston Cross had said, "Thank you, the complete economy of it," 2 words containing something she could not yet measure, but intended to. She slept before she finished the thought. Part 2. What the mountain tests. The first morning established the pattern, and the pattern revealed the men. Marin was awake before dawn. Not because she had slept poorly, though the bed was harder than what she was accustomed to, and the mountain cold came through the window with a directness that Indiana winters had not prepared her for. She was awake because she had always been awake before dawn. It was simply where she lived, in the hour before other people needed things, the only hour that belonged entirely to her. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. The ash from the previous night had settled into a gray quiet that told her it had been cold for hours. She found the kindling box beside the hearth and the matches on the shelf above it, and had a fire going in 12 minutes, which was not her best time but was respectable given an unfamiliar stove with a damper that required more persuasion than she was used to. The coffee she found in a tin on the second shelf was old enough to be philosophical about its own quality, but it was coffee, and she made it strong enough that the question of its age became irrelevant. She was looking at the shelves with the attention of someone taking inventory when Clem appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw her. Then he looked at the fire in the stove, at the coffee on the heat, at the way the kitchen had been quietly rearranged in the past 40 minutes into something that functioned better than it had when he went to sleep, and his face did the thing it apparently did when he felt something strongly, which was to show it completely without any of the defensive filtering that most adult faces learn to apply. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." She poured him coffee without being asked and set it on the table. "Sit down. I need to understand what food you actually have before I can tell you what I can make with it." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the mug with the gratitude of a man for whom hot coffee in the morning was not a given, but a gift. "You don't have to cook for us. I know I don't have to. I'm doing it because the alternative is watching 3 grown men eat something that qualifies as food, only technically, and I find that difficult." She was already moving along the shelves, opening tins, checking stores, making the silent calculation of what was there against what could be done with it. "Tell me what a normal week looks like. Work schedule when you're home, when you're not," Clem told her. He told her the way he did everything generously and in full, with digressions that circled back to the main point eventually, and with an enthusiasm for the details of the land and the cattle and the daily rhythm of the place. That was, she was beginning to understand, not chatter, but love. He loved this place. He loved the work of it. He simply could not talk about either without the words running faster than strictly necessary. By the time Rowan and Weston appeared, she had breakfast ready. Real breakfast. Eggs from the 3 hens Nash kept in a coop behind the barn, fried with salt pork. Biscuits made from scratch in 40 minutes. Coffee that had become coffee rather than an approximation of it. Rowan stopped in the doorway, exactly the way Clem had, but with a different expression. Clem's had been open delight. Rowan's was something more guarded, the expression of a man who has learned to be careful about letting good things surprise him. He sat down. He ate. He did not comment. Nash came in last, sleep-heavy, and moving with the careful economy of someone whose body is still negotiating with the morning. And when he saw the biscuits, he sat down and ate 3 of them before he was fully awake. It was Weston who Marin watched most carefully that first morning. He came in after Rowan and took the chair at the far end of the table that she had already identified as his by the fact that it was the chair with the clearest sight line to both the door and the window. He ate with the systematic attention of a man for whom food is fuel rather than pleasure, not ungrateful but efficient, and he said nothing at all until he was nearly finished, at which point he looked up and found her watching him and held her gaze for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to mean something before he looked back at his plate. After breakfast, the men went to work and took Nash with them, and Marin was alone in the cabin with the remains of the meal and the morning light coming through the windows and the mountains sitting outside like a fact she had not yet fully processed. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time they came back that evening, the kitchen floor had been scrubbed to a color she suspected it had not been in years. The stove had been degreased with a patience that bordered on archaeology. The supply shelves had been reorganized according to a system that prioritized access and rotation. She had taken down the window above the sink, which had been painted shut, freed it, cleaned it, and rehung it so that it actually opened. She had found fabric in a trunk in the hallway, good wool in burgundy, and cut it into curtains for the kitchen window. The curtains were perhaps unnecessary. She put them up anyway. Rowan stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room for a long moment. Then he went and washed his hands and sat down for supper without saying anything. But she noticed in the unhurried way she noticed things that he looked at the curtains twice during the meal with the expression of a man who feels something and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. He did not acknowledge it. Nash said, "Those curtains are the best thing that's happened to this kitchen since Clem fixed the stovepipe." Clem beamed as though he had been complimented. Weston looked at the curtains once, and then at Marin with that quiet, measuring attention, and said nothing which she was learning to understand was not the same as having nothing to say. The second week, she went looking for the chicken coop. She had noticed the hens on her first morning, 3 small and visibly underweight birds picking at nothing in particular in the yard with the dispirited air of animals that have stopped expecting improvement. The coop they returned to at night was a structure that had made certain architectural decisions. She disagreed with most of them involving the question of whether the roof needed to remain attached to the walls. She found Nash in the barn and asked him when the hens had last been properly fed. He looked at the ground. "We give them what we can." "What does that mean specifically?" "It means," he said with the honesty that was apparently his most consistent quality, "that when we remember." She spent the morning repairing the coop with tools she found in a box in the barn and materials she located by looking carefully at what was available. The hinge on the door was the most critical problem and took the longest to solve. By early afternoon, the structure was not beautiful, but it was sound, and she had filled the feeder and cleaned the water trough and left the hens in a space that would not actively work against their survival. That evening at supper, she said without particular emphasis, "Your chickens aren't laying because they're living in a structure that wouldn't keep a moderately determined wind out, let alone a predator, and because they're being fed sporadically. I've repaired the coop. They should start producing eggs within the week if they're fed consistently." She said this to the table in general, but she was aware that it landed on Rowan in particular because the set of his jaw changed slightly in the way it changed when he felt something he was not going to express. Nash, with the timing of someone who did not entirely understand social tension, said, "She's got you there, Rowan." Rowan said, "Finish your supper." But the next morning when Marin went to feed the chickens, she found the water trough had been filled and fresh straw laid in the nesting boxes, and Rowan was already gone out with Weston to check the herd. She stood in the doorway of the repaired coop for a moment and looked at the fresh straw and the clean water and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She fed the hens and went back inside and wrote in her notebook, He does not say what he does. He simply does it. The straw was fresh this morning. The water filled before I reached it. I am beginning to understand that he has always spoken this way. I was simply not paying the right kind of attention. On the 5th day, Clem taught her to ride. It was not his idea entirely. She had been watching the horses with the focused attention she brought to anything she wanted to understand, and one morning, Clem had caught her looking at them from the fence, with the expression of someone taking measurements, and he had said simply, "Do you want to learn?" The horse he put her on was a bay mare named Bess, wide and patient with the temperament of someone who has seen everything and found most of it manageable. Marin climbed onto the saddle with the practical approach she took to all physical challenges, which was to study the mechanics first and address the discomfort as a secondary consideration. She was not graceful. She had never been graceful, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. But she had strong legs and good balance, and the stubborn determination of someone for whom failure is a temporary condition requiring adjustment rather than a reason to stop. Clem was a good teacher because he was patient in the way of someone who genuinely enjoys the process of instruction, who takes pleasure in watching understanding arrive. He walked beside Bess and talked Marin through the weight and the reins and the language of communication between horse and rider, and when she did something wrong, he corrected it without making her feel the wrongness, which was a skill she had encountered rarely enough in her life to recognize as unusual. Weston watched from the fence for a while. She was aware of him there without looking directly at him, the way you are aware of weather coming without necessarily facing it. When she finally looked over, he was not watching her riding. He was watching her face. She looked away before he could see that she had noticed. After the 3rd morning of riding lessons, she could stay on Bess for an hour without her legs registering formal complaint. After the 5th, she could change direction without the negotiation taking longer than it needed to. She wrote in her notebook, "The horse learns you as much as you learn the horse." This is probably true of everything here. It was during the 2nd week that Rowan came to find her in the barn. She was brushing Bess, which she had taken to doing in the evenings because she found it clarifying the simple physical rhythm of it. Rowan came in without announcing himself and sat on a crate near the door, and she kept brushing because she had decided early that the right response to Rowan Holt was usually to continue doing what she was doing and let him arrive at his words in his own time. He looked at his right hand, at the burn scars. "William helped me build this barn," he said. She kept brushing. "He was better at it than me. Faster, more precise. I was the one who could carry more, and he was the one who knew where everything should go." He paused. "We worked together for 3 years on this property before the fire. By the end, we could build a wall without talking, just from knowing what the other one needed next." "What was he like?" she asked. Not the fire, not the death, but him. Rowan was quiet for a moment, surprised by the question, or by something in himself that the question had reached. He laughed at things I didn't think were funny, and he was usually right that they were funny. A pause. He was better with people than I was. He knew how to be in a room with someone without making them feel they were being assessed. You don't think you know how to do that? I know I don't. Marin stopped brushing and looked at him directly. You're doing it right now. Being in this barn with me without making me feel assessed. He looked up. You're not assessing me, she said. You're talking to me. Those are different. He held her gaze for a moment, with an expression she was finally beginning to be able to read. Not the careful neutrality he showed the world, but something underneath it, something that had been there long enough to have grown very quiet. Then he looked back at his hands. Anne, he said. The woman before. She said I made her feel like a problem I was trying to solve. Did she say that, or did you figure it out afterward? Another pause. Both. Were you? Probably. He turned his scarred hand over. I don't know how to want something without thinking about all the ways it might not work. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That is not the same as being cold. It is a different thing entirely. He did not respond, but he stayed in the barn for another 20 minutes, and they talked about William, and about the land, and about what the first winter here had been like. And none of it was easy conversation, but all of it was real. And when he left, he paused at the door and said, You should know that Bess has favored her left front leg since last spring. Go easy on the downhill. She looked at him. I forgot to mention it, he said, and went. She stood in the barn with the brush in her hand and understood that he had not forgotten to mention it at all. The storm came in the third week without adequate warning, which was, Nash told her afterward, a thing that happened in the mountains with a frequency that made preparation the only reasonable response. It was a spring snow unseasonable and heavy, the kind that arrived with apologetic swiftness and left consequences that lasted longer than it had any right to. The sky went from uncertain to committed in the space of 2 hours, and by the time the full weight of it arrived, Rowan and Weston were on the far side of the property, checking the north fence line, and could not get back quickly, and Nash had turned his ankle on the ice that formed at the base of the porch steps, and Clem was in the grip of the fever that had been building since the day before, which he had mentioned only when Marin had noticed it herself and asked him directly. The horses were in the outer stable 200 steps from the cabin. The temperature was dropping with the focused intention of something that means to cause harm. At those temperatures by morning the horses would be in serious difficulty. Marin put on every layer she owned and went out. Miss Marin, Nash called from the doorway, his wrapped ankle barely holding his weight. Clem needs to stay inside. Your ankle won't hold. I can count steps. She turned up her collar. 200 out, 200 back. I've done harder arithmetic than that. She had in fact done harder arithmetic than that. She was less certain she had done it in conditions quite like these. The snow was not falling so much as arriving from every direction simultaneously driven by a wind that had no interest in her preferences or her timeline. She counted her steps with the deliberate attention of someone who knows that the alternative to paying attention is not arriving. She found the stable. The horses were frightened, circling in their stalls with the tight contained panic of large animals in small spaces who have decided that standing still is no longer adequate to their feelings. She worked steadily, talking to them in the low, even voice she used when she needed something to be calmer than it felt like being forking hay and checking water and making sure the doors were latched against the wind. The return trip was harder. The snow had deepened, and the tracks she had made going out were already half filled, and she went 30 steps in the wrong direction before she understood she had gone 30 steps in the wrong direction and stopped. She stood in the white silence and listened for the sound of the cabin. Wind through a chimney produces a particular note at a particular angle, and she had been listening to the chimney of this cabin for 3 weeks. She found the sound and walked toward it. She was 10 steps from the porch when Rowan appeared out of the white. He and Weston had come back by the south route faster in the storm. He reached her in 3 strides and put one hand on her arm, not gently with the grip of someone who has been frightened and is expressing it as force. The horses, she said. Are fine, he said. Come inside. Weston was already there holding the door. He put his coat around her shoulders before she had fully crossed the threshold, a single efficient motion, and she understood this was not tenderness performed, but simply the fastest way to address the fact that she was cold. By the fire with Clem coughing from his room, and Nash sitting on the floor with his ankle elevated, and the cabin full of the relief of a crisis that has been survived. Rowan sat across from her and looked at her for a long time. You didn't have to do that, he said. The horses would have died. I know. Then I did have to do that. Something moved through his expression, something he had not planned. You could have been lost out there. I wasn't. You could have been. Yes. She met his eyes. So could you every time you go out in weather like this to check a fence line? The difference is that when you do it, it's called necessary. When I do it, it's called reckless. He did not have an answer to that. She had not expected him to. But the next morning before she was up, someone had gone to the stable and left extra hay and checked all the water. She found this out from Nash, who told her because Nash told her everything. She did not ask Rowan about it. She simply noted it and moved on. It was in the 4th week that Grant McAllister came up the mountain. She heard the horses before she saw them, 4 of them, and she was on the porch with a basket of laundry when the riders came into the yard. The man at the front was unmistakable in the way of men who have spent a long time ensuring they are unmistakable. He was perhaps 55 broad in the way of someone who had been physically powerful and had allowed prosperity to revise the nature of that power, and he wore a coat that was too fine for the mud of the mountain road and seemed to consider this a point in his favor. Military decorations caught the light on his lapel when the wind moved his coat. Union Army. He wore them the way some men wear their history as credential rather than memory. Rowan came out of the barn when he heard the horses and stood in the yard with his arms at his sides. Clem came from behind the cabin. Weston appeared from nowhere in particular, which was where he usually appeared from. Holt. McAllister said it the way you say a name when you want the person to feel that you know more about them than they are comfortable with. Heard you had someone new out here. McAllister. Rowan's voice had gone to the flat register she associated with him being very controlled about something he did not feel flat about. You've made this trip before. The answer hasn't changed. $10,000, McAllister said. For the land, the cabin, the water rights. That is a generous offer for a property that has had a difficult season. The answer is no. McAllister looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the yard, with the unhurried assessment of a man who believes that everything he looks at will eventually belong to him. Then his eyes found Marin on the porch and stayed there. The mail-order bride, he said. Not a question. My wife, Rowan said, and the words came out before Marin could see him decide to say them, automatic and absolute, the words of a man who has crossed a line without planning to and finds standing on the other side of it that he does not want to go back. Clem looked at Rowan. Weston looked at Rowan. Neither of them said anything. McAllister smiled the slow smile of someone filing information. Well then, you have more to consider than just yourself. He looked at Marin with something that was almost sympathy and was entirely condescending. Think about the offer, ma'am. This is hard country, harder than most people are built for. I'll keep that in mind, she said with the pleasant evenness of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life and has developed a comprehensive strategy for it. McAllister turned his horse. His men followed. When they were gone, Clem exhaled audibly. Wife, he said to Rowan. Rowan walked back into the barn without responding. Weston looked at Marin on the porch. She looked at Weston. Neither of them said anything, but in the silence between them, something was confirmed that had been accumulating since the first morning at the kitchen table when he had said thank you, in a way that contained more than 2 words. Nash said from the doorway where he had apparently been watching everything. That was the most interesting thing I've seen since the time the Henderson's mule got into the... Nash, Weston said. Right, Nash said. Going to check on the chickens. It was the 5th week when Marin found the calf. She heard it before she saw it, the distressed bawling of a young animal in the kind of trouble that gets worse the more it panics. She followed the sound to the creek and found the calf tangled in a collapse of branches along the bank, one leg wedged between 2 submerged logs, the current pushing against it with the patient insistence of water that has no particular opinion about outcomes. The mother cow was on the bank, moving in tight circles with the helpless urgency of an animal that knows something is wrong and cannot solve it. Marin did not go back for help. The water was cold and moving fast, and the calf was panicking toward a worse position with every minute. She went into the creek. The cold was a physical fact that required acknowledgement and then management. She waded to where the calf was caught and put her hands on the nearest submerged log and pulled, feeling the way the branch network resisted, understanding the geometry of the problem, the way she understood all problems by finding where the resistance was and applying force at the point that would produce the most movement. She was working at this when Weston arrived. She did not know how long he had been there before he spoke. With Weston, the duration of his silent observation was always longer than she had accounted for. "The log on the left," he said. "There's a branch pinning it. If you can break that branch, the whole thing shifts." She found the branch by feel, submerged thick but cracked near the base. She pressed against it with her knee and felt it give. The log shifted. The calf's leg came free. The animal lurched toward the bank with the panicked energy of something that has just escaped, catching Marin in the ribs with its back legs as it went. The blow knocked the air from her and put her knees on the creek bed, and she swallowed water before she got her feet under her. Weston was in the water beside her in the time it took her to get upright. He put his shoulder against her side and steadied her from there, supporting without restraining, which was a different thing entirely. "Ribs," she said when she had enough air to say it. "How bad?" She tested it carefully. "Not broken. Bad bruise." They got out of the creek. The calf was already at its mother, shaking and indignant, and apparently unaware of the debt it had just incurred. Weston looked at Marin with the thorough, impersonal attention of someone assessing damage. "Can you walk?" "I just walked out of the creek." "Can you walk comfortably?" "No, but I can walk." He nodded once, accepting this. He did not tell her she should not have gone into the water. He did not tell her it was reckless. He said, "Lean if you need to," and walked back to the cabin beside her, close enough to be useful without making the offer explicit. That evening, when her ribs had been wrapped with a bandage that Clem produced from a medical kit, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has wrapped ribs before, and when Nash had been sent to do something elsewhere with a look from Weston that communicated this clearly, Rowan sat across from her at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and said something she had not expected. "You saved that calf." "Weston helped. Weston helped after you were already in the water." He looked at his hands. "I need to say something, and I am not good at saying things, so I need you to let me get through it." She waited. "When you came off that stagecoach in Greystone Creek, I thought my life was collapsing in one more direction. The woman my brother had spent 8 months writing to had run off with someone who could offer her more, and the person who showed up instead was someone I had not asked for and did not know what to do with." He stopped. "It took me 3 days to understand that what I had been given was better than what I had asked for. It took me another week to understand why I could not admit that. And it took me until right now, watching you come back from that creek with your ribs cracked and not a single word of complaint, to understand what I am actually afraid of." She said nothing. "I am afraid that I do not deserve this," he said. "That is what it comes down to. Not that you will leave, not that the arrangement will fail, that I will get something I actually want, and I will not be enough to hold on to it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the mountain did what it always did in the evening, settled into its own enormous silence, indifferent to what happened in the small, warm spaces within it. Marin looked at Rowan Holt across the table and thought about the 28 years she had spent being the one nobody chose, and the 48 hours she had spent deciding to be the one who chose instead. And she said, "The man who does not think he is enough is usually the man who is trying the hardest to be enough. Those are not the same person as the man who actually is not enough. He held her gaze. "I came here because I had nowhere better to go," she said. "That is true, but I am staying because I want to stay. Those are also two different things." He nodded slowly, not with relief exactly, with something more like recognition, as though she had said back to him something he had known for a long time, but had not had the language for. That night Weston found her on the back porch. She had come out for the stars, which she had not stopped finding extraordinary in 5 weeks and did not expect to stop finding extraordinary anytime soon. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his particular footfall, deliberate and nearly silent. He sat down on the step below her without asking and looked out at the dark. "Gettysburg," he said after a while. She waited. "I made a decision in the 3rd day of that battle that cost 4 men their lives. I was 21. I made the decision fast because fast seemed like the right speed, and it was the wrong speed." He looked at his hands in the dark. "I have been slow ever since." "Is that why you didn't write any letters?" she asked. "When Clem was writing to Violet, I did not know what to say to a woman I had not met. I did not know how to be honest with someone I had not yet decided to trust." A pause. "I trust you." She looked at his profile in the thin starlight. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the cabin is warmer or because the cooking is better, though both of those things are true. Because I have been paying attention to you for 5 weeks, and I have not found the thing that makes you less than what I thought you were. Usually I find it." She said, "You will find things. Everyone has things." "I know. I'm saying I want to be there when I find them." The stars were very clear. The mountain was very dark. Inside the cabin, she could hear Nash moving around in the kitchen, probably investigating whether there was anything left from supper, and beyond that, the low murmur of Clem and Rowan in conversation. She said, "The 6 weeks end in 9 days." "I know. Rowan said something tonight." "I know. I was in the hallway." He turned to look at her, then directly in the way he did everything, without the social softening that most people applied to direct attention. "I am not good at the same things he is not good at. But I am not good at them in different ways, and I thought you should know that before the 6 weeks end." "What are you good at?" she asked. He thought about it with genuine consideration. "Staying," he said finally. "I am good at staying." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the stars. Neither of them said anything else, but neither of them went inside for a long time. It was the morning of the 5th week's end that they found the cattle. Nash discovered it first running back from the lower pasture with a face the color of old ash, and by the time he had finished speaking, they were all already moving. 6 head of cattle dead in the night scattered across the lower pasture in the stillness of animals that had dropped where they stood. 4 more were visibly sick, moving with the uncoordinated distress of something that has been poisoned and does not understand why it cannot simply stop feeling this way. Weston went to the water source without being asked. He crouched there for a long time, examining, not touching, with the careful attention of someone reading a document. When he stood up, his face was the face he wore when he knew something he did not want to know. "Not natural," he said. Rowan stood at the edge of the pasture and looked at the dead animals and said nothing for a very long time. Maren stood beside him. She did not try to fill the silence. She understood that some silences need to complete themselves before anything else can happen. "McAllister," Rowan said finally. "Not a question." "He was the one surprised when you refused," she said. "Twice. I have no proof." "Then we find proof." She looked at him. "What do we do first?" He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the guardedness and not the careful management, but something simpler and more fundamental. the expression of a person who has just understood that they are not alone in a problem they expected to carry by themselves. "We move the rest of the herd to the north pasture," he said, "away from this water source. Today. I'll help." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I know you will," and went to get the horses. That evening, after hours of work that left all of them worn to the edge of their individual endurance, Maren sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open and did not write in it. She just sat with it the way she had sat with it in the dark of her first night here, not recording but thinking. Nash came in and sat across from her. He had been unusually quiet since the morning, which was unusual enough to mean something. "You're not scared," he said. It was almost an accusation. "I am scared," she said. "I've been scared since I stepped off the stagecoach in Greystone Creek. Fear is just information. It tells you what matters. It doesn't have to tell you what to do." Nash looked at her with the open assessment he had never learned to disguise. "Violet wouldn't have lasted a week. Violet is not here. I am." He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Maren, what happens if McAllister doesn't stop?" She looked at the notebook. At the notes she had made over 5 weeks about 3 men and a piece of land and a life that had not existed when she stepped onto the stagecoach in Lafayette. "Then we make sure he stops," she said. "That's what happens." Nash nodded slowly with the nod of someone deciding to believe in something. Outside, the mountain was quiet in its vast and indifferent way. The cattle in the north pasture were settling. The creek was running. The stars were doing what they always did at this altitude, covering the sky with a density of light that made all the darkness underneath seem temporary. Maren closed her notebook and went to help Clem with supper. There were 7 days left of 6 weeks. There was a man on the mountain who had decided their land was already his. There was a family that had not existed 3 months ago and was becoming something she did not have a word for, yet something that felt for the first time in her 28 years like the right size and shape for the space she actually occupied in the world. She cut the bread and set it on the table and called them in to eat. All 4 of them came. Part 3. What the Mountain Keeps. The morning of the 42nd day arrived the way significant days often do, without announcement, dressed in the ordinary clothes of any other morning. Maren was at the stove when she heard the horses. Not the horses in the stable, not the familiar sound of Rowan or Weston going out before dawn. These were different horses coming up the mountain road from the direction of town, and there were 2 of them, and the sound of the wheels behind them told her this was not a working visit. She set down the coffee pot and went to the window. The carriage was the kind that did not belong on a mountain road, and knew it, the lacquered finish already dulled by the dust of the climb, the wheels navigating the ruts with the stiff reluctance of an expensive thing being asked to do something beneath its station. It was a city carriage. It had come from a considerable distance to be here, which meant someone had decided the trip was worth the trouble. She knew before it stopped. She recognized the figure that stepped down first, Chester Bloom, whose photograph she had seen once in Violet's room, a handsome man in the way of men who have spent money on their appearance and consider the investment well made. His suit was gray and his shoes were city shoes, and he looked at the yard of the Holt property with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they did not want to arrive but have decided to make the best of. Then Violet stepped down. Maren had not seen her sister in 6 weeks. In the compressed arithmetic of what those 6 weeks had contained, it felt longer than that the way time expands when it is full of things that matter. Violet looked the way she always looked, small and golden, and carrying the quality of someone for whom rooms rearranged themselves slightly upon entry. Her traveling clothes were blue and well made, and she wore them with the ease of someone who has always had nice things and expects to continue having them. But Maren saw her sister's eyes before she saw anything else about her, and in her sister's eyes, beneath the composure and the beauty and the careful arrangement of an expression designed to communicate confidence, there was something that looked very much like a woman who has made a choice and is living inside the consequences of it and has not yet decided what she thinks of them. Rowan came out of the barn. Clem appeared from behind the cabin. Weston materialized from the direction of the tree line, which was where he usually materialized from when something required his attention without having been announced. Chester Bloom smiled the smile of a man conducting a transaction he expects to complete quickly. "Mr. Holt, I apologize for the unannounced visit. I'm Chester Bloom. I believe you've been corresponding with my wife's family." "I know who you are," Rowan said. The flatness of it stopped Chester Bloom for exactly 1 second, which was enough time for Marin to walk down the porch steps and into the yard. Violet saw her the moment she turned. The two sisters looked at each other across 20 feet of mountain yard, and the 6 weeks of divergent living that had passed since the morning. Marin found the letter on the kitchen table, and in the silence of that exchange, more was communicated than any amount of subsequent conversation would manage to improve upon. Chester Bloom stepped forward with the energy of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say. "Miss Alderman, Marin, Violet has been worried sick. We both have. This whole situation has been an unfortunate misunderstanding, and we've come to set things right." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "I've brought sufficient funds to compensate Mr. Holt fully for any expenses incurred. $55 plus additional consideration for inconvenience. And I've taken the liberty of making inquiries about suitable employment in Indianapolis that would suit a woman of your capabilities." He said it with the generous confidence of a man who has solved a problem on behalf of someone who did not ask him to solve it. Clem looked at Rowan. Nash, standing in the barn doorway where he had arrived silently to observe, looked at Clem. Weston watched Chester Bloom with the patient attention he gave to things that required careful handling. Rowan said nothing, but he looked at Marin, and in the look she recognized the question he was actually asking, which was not whether she wanted to stay, but whether she was all right, and whether anything in the last 60 seconds had changed what she knew about herself. It had not. "Mr. Bloom," she said, "I appreciate you making the trip. Of course, Violet has been beside herself. I'm sure she has." Marin looked at her sister directly, with the clear and uncomplicated attention she gave to things she needed to understand. "Chester, I'm going to speak with Violet alone for a moment. This won't take long." Chester Bloom opened his mouth, closed it. The authority in Marin's voice was not the authority of someone who had practiced it, but the authority of someone who has always had it and simply not had occasion to use it in rooms where people were paying attention. He stepped back. Marin walked to where her sister stood and stopped an arm's length away. "You're not happy," she said quietly enough that only Violet could hear. Violet's composure did something complicated. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you're not happy." A pause. Something moved through her sister's face that Marin recognized because she had seen it before, the expression of someone deciding how honest to be with the person who has always known when they were lying. "He's not unkind," Violet said finally. "That's not what I asked either." Violet looked at her, and in her eyes was the complex mixture of things that existed between sisters who have known each other their entire lives: love and competition and guilt, and the grief of a person who has understood too late that they have wanted the wrong thing. "Is it what you thought it would be, up here?" Marin looked back at the cabin, at the mountains behind it that she had been learning for 6 weeks and would spend the rest of her life continuing to learn, at the 3 men who were standing with the studied naturalness of people trying not to appear to be watching while absolutely watching, at Nash in the doorway with his honest face doing nothing to conceal the fact that he was invested in this outcome. "No," she said, "it's nothing like what I thought." She looked back at her sister. "It's harder and colder and more demanding than anything I imagined, and I have not wanted to leave for a single day of any of it." Violet was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice that contained the quality of someone releasing something they had been holding tightly, "You look different." "I am different." "Good different." "I think so." Violet reached out and took her hand briefly, the gesture of a sister who does not know how to apologize for large things and is doing what she can with the currency of small ones. "I'm sorry about the money. I'm sorry about all of it." "I know you are." Marin squeezed her hand and let it go. "Go home, Violet. Take care of what you've chosen. And if what you've chosen stops being worth taking care of you, write me a letter and I will write back." Violet nodded. Her eyes were bright with something she was not going to call crying in the middle of a mountain yard in front of people she didn't know. Marin walked back to the group. Chester Bloom was still holding the envelope. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his model of the situation. "Miss Alderman, I want you to understand that your family's position is secure regardless. The money is not necessary," Rowan said. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Chester Bloom with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who has crossed a line and found the footing on the other side better than expected. "The arrangement between your wife and this household is concluded. The debt is settled. Marin is here by her own choice and mine, and that is the end of this conversation." Chester Bloom looked at Rowan, at Clem, who was nodding with the wholehearted agreement of someone who has been wanting to say this himself, but has been correctly exercising patience, at Weston, who was simply standing there in the way that Weston stood when something was decided, and the only remaining question was whether the other party understood that. Chester Bloom put the envelope back in his coat. "I see," he said in a tone that communicated that he saw, but did not approve of what he saw. He looked at Marin one more time with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who has come to rescue someone and discovered that the person does not experience their situation as requiring rescue. "If you change your mind—" "She won't," Clem said cheerfully. Chester Bloom looked at Clem for a moment. Then he walked back to the carriage. Violet, climbing up, looked back once. She looked at Marin, and the look she gave her was not the look of someone leaving behind something they had wanted. It was the look of someone leaving behind something they had not known they wanted, until the moment it became clear they could not have it. But beneath that quiet and genuine, there was something that looked like relief, the relief of a sister who has been carrying guilt like a stone and has just been told she can set it down. The carriage turned and went back down the mountain road. They stood in the yard and watched it go until the sound of it disappeared into the trees. Nash said, "Well." "Inside," Rowan said. "There's work." 3 evenings later, Clem found Marin in the kitchen after supper, and he stood in the doorway with the expression he wore when he had been thinking about something long enough that it had become necessary to say it. She was drying the dishes. She did not stop when he came in because she had learned that Clem spoke better when she was doing something else, when the conversation had somewhere to exist other than in the direct space between two people looking at each other. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. I know Rowan said something to you last week, in the barn, and I know Weston said something to you on the porch, because I was inside, and I could not hear the words. But I could hear that there were words, which is almost the same thing with Weston." He paused. "I want to say my thing, too. Not because it's a competition, but because I think people should say what they mean while they still can, and I have not always been good at that." She set down a plate and turned to look at him. Clem had the kind of face that was difficult to be dishonest in front of, not because it was intimidating, but because it was so entirely open that dishonesty felt like a particular kind of unkindness. He looked at her with everything he felt showing plainly, and what he felt was not complicated. I knew from the minute you walked off that stagecoach, he said. Not what it would become, I didn't know that exactly, but I knew you were real in a way that Violet, God bless her, never was to me. Violet was letters. You are a person who walked into this kitchen and made cornbread out of nothing and fixed the chicken coop and went out into a blizzard for horses she had only known 3 weeks. He stopped. I want you to stay, not because you're useful, though you are, because when you're here, this place feels like it was built for a reason. And I built this place. I know better than anyone that it was missing something I couldn't name until you named it by being here. The kitchen was quiet. Marin looked at Clem Holt, who had written 8 months of letters to a woman he had never met, and had been the one to ask her if she could cook, and had laughed with her on the 3rd day about something she could not even remember now, and had been consistently and without strategy exactly who he appeared to be. Thank you, Clem, she said. Is that a yes? That is a thank you. The rest is still being decided. He nodded, accepting this with the equanimity of a man who trusts the process because he trusts the people involved in it. That's fair. He picked up his jacket from the chair. I'm going to check on the north pasture. The second fence post from the gate has been looking unsteady. Clem. He stopped in the doorway. I want to be here, she said. I wanted you to know that. He smiled. It was the smile she had first seen at the depot in Greystone Creek, the smile that had started before the situation warranted it and had kept going anyway. I know, he said. I've known since you fixed the chicken coop. He went out. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his footsteps on the porch and thought about the particular luck of knowing someone who says what he means. The following morning, she found something on the table beside her coffee cup, a small object carved from pale mountain pine no larger than her palm. A hawk in flight wings spread at the precise angle of a bird riding an updraft, rather than fighting the wind every feather suggested, with the economy of someone who knew exactly how much detail was necessary and nothing beyond that. It was not decorative in the way of something made to impress. It was precise in the way of something made to say a specific thing. She picked it up. It was warm from the kitchen, which meant it had not been left in the night. She turned it over and found in the flat underside of the base 3 letters cut very small into the wood. W.C. She sat with it in both hands for a moment. Weston came in from outside, moving through the kitchen with his usual economy, heading for the coffee on the stove. He did not look at the carving. He did not look at her. 3 weeks, she said. He poured his coffee. Nash told me you work on things in the evenings when you can't sleep. He said it's been 3 weeks. Weston turned and leaned against the counter and looked at her with that direct, contained attention. You watched a hawk riding the updraft on the East Ridge the 2nd week. You stopped walking and just watched it for almost 2 minutes. She looked at the carving. You said afterward, he continued, that you wanted to understand how it knew which direction to lean into, whether it was instinct or whether it learned it. He paused. I thought about that for a while. And I think it's both. I think the instinct tells you that leaning is possible. The learning tells you which direction. He looked at his coffee. You leaned into this. All of it. From the first morning. She turned the hawk over in her hands. The wings were perfect. The angle of the tail was exactly right. The slight tilt that meant the bird was controlling rather than being controlled by the air it moved through. She said, You are the hardest person here to know. I know. I have been trying since the first morning. I know that too. He looked at her. Most people stop trying after the first week. You wrote things in your notebook instead. You kept adjusting your approach. Something shifted in his expression very slightly. I found that I was paying attention to that. She set the carving down carefully with the deliberateness of someone placing something they intend to keep. Why a hawk? Because you asked the right question about it. He picked up his coffee. The right question is never how to stop being afraid of the wind. It's how to use it." He went back outside. She sat with the hawk on the table in front of her, and the morning light coming through the curtains she had made, and she thought about what it meant to be known by someone who had spent 3 weeks carving the exact shape of a thing you had wondered about aloud, and she decided that it meant something she did not have a sufficient word for yet, and was content to wait until she did. 2 days later, on a morning that began with the clarity of mountain light through clean windows, Rowan came to find her in the barn. He did not go to the crate this time. He stood near the door with his hat in his hands, which was the first time she had seen him holding his hat rather than wearing it, and she understood this was not accidental. She kept brushing Bess and waited. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as the arrangement we made in Greystone Creek, as something permanent, as my wife and as part of what this place is." She kept brushing. "I know I am not the easiest person to know. I know I have more history than I have resolved, and more guilt than is probably useful, and I have been told by more than one person that I make them feel assessed when I am actually just paying attention." He stopped. "But I want to try. I want to try with you specifically, not with the idea of a woman who would come here, but with you." She set the brush down and turned. "You said something to me in this barn," he continued. "You said the man who wonders if he deserves something is usually the man who is trying hardest to deserve it. I have been thinking about that for 2 weeks." He looked at his scarred hand. "I think you might be right. I think William would say you were right. He was better at this kind of thing than I am, but he would have liked you." She crossed the distance between them and stopped 2 feet away. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "Yes," she said again with the same clarity she had used standing in the main street of Greystone Creek 6 weeks ago, the voice of a woman who has made her calculation and is done with hedging. "I will stay, not because I have nowhere better to be, because I am choosing this. I am choosing this land and this cabin, and the 3 of you and I am choosing it as something I want, not something I settled for." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "We should go to town. There's a reverend. Is he sober?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Usually." "Then let's go." Reverend James Porter of Greystone Creek was 67 years old and had presided over enough frontier weddings to have developed a comprehensive theology about what actually mattered in a marriage, which was not the ceremony, but the people who showed up to it and what they were willing to do when things got difficult afterward. He married Maren Alderman and Rowan Holt in the back room of his church on a Tuesday morning with Clem and Weston as witnesses, and Nash standing in the doorway because the room was too small for 4 witnesses, but nobody had suggested he leave. The ceremony was short in the way of ceremonies conducted by people who believe that the meaning resides in the commitment rather than the duration of the proceedings. At the part where Porter asked Maren if she understood what she was entering into, she said, "I understand it completely, Reverend." Porter looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man who has heard that said before, but rarely with this quality of precision. "All right, then," he said and continued. When it was done, Clem shook Rowan's hand, and then, with the wholehearted instinct that governed all of his actions, embraced him, which Rowan endured with the patient affection of a man for his brother. Weston shook both their hands in sequence with the quiet formality of someone for whom handshakes are genuine contracts. Nash said something enthusiastic and only partially coherent that contained the words, "Congratulations," and finally, and also, some reference to the cornbread. They drove back up the mountain in the late afternoon light with the satisfaction that comes from having done a difficult thing correctly. They were still half a mile from the cabin when they saw the smoke. It was not the chimney. The chimney smoke of the Holt cabin was a thin, domestic column that rose straight in still air and dispersed gently in wind. This was different, darker and lower, rising from the direction of the woodshed and the east fence line where the stored winter supplies lived in stacked order. Rowan had the wagon moving faster before anyone spoke. Nash was in the yard when they arrived, his face the color it went when he was frightened and managing it. Behind him, visible through the smoke, a man was running toward the tree line, fleet and purposeful. Weston was off his horse before it stopped. The fire was in the woodshed, caught in the dry timber of the stacked wall facing the barn, not yet large, but with the enthusiastic potential of fire in dry wood on a dry day. Clem and Rowan moved to it with the practiced efficiency of men who have thought about this possibility and know where the water barrels are kept. Marin went to Nash. "How many?" she asked. "Two," Nash said. "One ran when he saw me. Weston went after the other." Weston came back 10 minutes later with a young man held firmly by one arm. The young man was perhaps 20, fair-haired, wearing the clothes of a ranch hand, without the bearing of someone who had chosen this work willingly. He looked at the ground and said nothing until Weston stopped in front of Rowan and let go of his arm and simply waited. The young man's name given reluctantly, and then with the relief of someone who has decided that a smaller consequence now is preferable to a larger one later, was Dalton Reeves. He worked at McAllister's property. He had been paid to come here with one specific instruction, which he described with the halting honesty of someone who is frightened enough to be truthful and intelligent enough to understand that truthfulness is his best current option. The instruction had not been only to start the fire. McAllister's full intention, Dalton Reeves explained, was a 3-part campaign to be executed over consecutive weeks. The fire first to demonstrate capability and to begin the process of driving down the value and the morale of the Holt property. Then further interference with the water sources. Then, when Rowan Holt was sufficiently reduced by losses and anxiety, a legal challenge to the water rights that McAllister had been preparing with a territorial attorney for the better part of a year. 2 members of the Territorial Land Commission had already received payments that had nothing to do with their official salaries. He told them all of this in a flat, exhausted voice, looking at the ground while the fire in the woodshed was extinguished behind him and the mountain evening settled into the cool and impartial silence it settled into regardless of what was happening in the small, warm spaces within it. When he finished, no one spoke for a moment. Marin said, "Mr. Reeves, would you be willing to make this statement to a federal judge?" He looked up at her for the first time. He was younger than she had thought when he was running barely more than a boy, with the face of someone who had made a decision for money that had seemed larger than the consequences at the time, and had since revised that assessment entirely. "McAllister would," he started. "McAllister will have considerably less capacity to do anything to you if he is in federal custody," she said with the even certainty of someone presenting arithmetic rather than opinion. "You did not complete what you were sent to do. You were apprehended at the scene. Your cooperation is the difference between being charged as an accomplice and being the witness who brought down a corrupt land operation. Those outcomes are not equivalent." Dalton Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Weston, who was standing very still with the expression of someone who has already decided what happens next, but is allowing the present moment to arrive at it in its own time. "Yes," Dalton Reeves said. "I'll testify." Rowan looked at Marin. The look he gave her was the look he had given her in the barn on the day she arrived, measuring and recalibrating. But this time what he was recalibrating was not his assessment of her, but his assessment of what was possible when 2 people face the same problem from the same side. "Weston," he said, "you know Judge Briggs in Denver." "I know the man who knows him," Weston said, which was how Weston knew everyone through the careful network of trust he had built, one verified person at a time. "I can have a letter to him in 2 days. Write it tonight." McAllister had not become the most powerful landowner in that part of Colorado Territory without developing a comprehensive sense of his own invulnerability. He had built it over 2 decades through the application of money and patience and the understanding that most people, when facing a large enough force, will eventually move. He had not in those 2 decades encountered Maren Holt. The letter to Judge Thomas Briggs went out the next morning with Weston writing it personally to the postal relay station in Greystone Creek. It contained Dalton Reeves's account signed and witnessed. It contained the physical evidence of the fire documented in Maren's precise and unambiguous handwriting, dated and described with the thoroughness of someone who had been trained by necessity to keep records that could withstand scrutiny. And it contained something Maren had spent the evening composing, while the others slept, a document outlining the pattern of McAllister's operations against small landholders in the territory over the previous 5 years, drawn from information she had been quietly gathering since McAllister's first visit to the property, from conversations in Greystone Creek during supply runs, from Nash's observations, from the careful accumulation of details that most people did not recognize as a pattern because they were only looking at their own piece of it. 12 other landholders had stories. Maren had written to 6 of them in the preceding weeks quietly, without telling anyone she was doing it, because she had understood from McAllister's first visit that the problem was not singular and that singular solutions would not be sufficient. 8 of them wrote back. All 8 were willing to testify. It was Nash who told her 2 weeks before the hearing that Dorothy McAllister had spent the autumn telling anyone in Greystone Creek who would listen that Maren was a last resort who would not last the winter. Nash reported this with the indignant loyalty of someone who takes such things personally on another person's behalf. Maren wrote it in her notebook under the date and did not think about it again until she saw Dorothy McAllister standing at the edge of the courthouse crowd on the day the verdict came in. Judge Briggs arrived in Greystone Creek 6 weeks after Weston's letter reached him, which was faster than anyone had expected, and suggested that the letter had reached a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation for some time. The hearing lasted 2 days. It was not a trial in the full formal sense, but a territorial proceeding which operated with the pragmatic efficiency of frontier justice applied by a man who took his responsibility seriously and had no patience for delay. Dalton Reeves testified. The 8 landholders testified. The 2 members of the Land Commission, faced with the specific and well-documented nature of the charges against them, made the calculation that McAllister's protection was worth considerably less than their own freedom and provided testimony of their own. McAllister's attorney argued. McAllister himself sat in the chair reserved for the accused with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years being certain of outcomes and is experiencing for the first time in his adult life the sensation of not knowing how this ends. It ended with 6 years in the federal penitentiary and the forfeiture of all contested water rights back to their original claimants. When the verdict was read, the room made noise. Maren did not make noise. She sat between Rowan and Clem with her hands folded in her lap and watched McAllister's face when the words reached him, and she thought about the morning she had stepped off the stagecoach in Greystone Creek with her single bag and her notebook full of observations about people she had not yet met, and she thought about how different the arithmetic of her life looked from this side of the calculation. Rowan's hand found hers, not a gesture, not a performance, simply the hand of a man who wanted to be in contact with the person beside him at this particular moment, the way you want to be in contact with the things that are real when reality is doing something worth noting. She held it. Outside the courthouse, in the thin mountain sunshine of an October afternoon, Dorothy McAllister stood at the edge of the gathered crowd in her fine traveling clothes, with the expression of a woman who has watched something very large fall over and is making rapid adjustments to her understanding of which direction is now up. She looked at Maren once with the particular look of a woman who has underestimated another woman and is arriving at a sophisticated understanding of the magnitude of that error. Then she turned and walked to her carriage and did not look back. Clem, standing behind Maren, said very quietly, She told half the town you were a last resort who wouldn't last the winter." "I know," Marin said. "How do you know?" "Nash told me. Nash tells me everything." From somewhere in the crowd, Nash, who had ridden into town for precisely this occasion, raised a hand in acknowledgement of a principle he had not known was being discussed. The winter came the way winters come to that altitude, without apology and without negotiation, but they were ready for it. The woodshed had been rebuilt and filled. The cattle were in the north pasture with the water source tested and clean. The cabin had been winterized with the combined attention of 4 people and 1 boy who had decided that preparation was preferable to endurance, and the kitchen had been stocked by Marin with the methodical foresight of someone who had learned to take the mountains seriously. The days shortened. The temperature dropped with the deliberateness of something that has given plenty of warning and expects to be taken at its word. Snow came first to the high peaks, and then worked its way down toward them like a slow decision being made. They were inside more. The rhythms of the place adjusted the domestic intimacy of people confined by weather to the same rooms, the negotiation of space and silence, and the things that need to be said, and the things that are better left in their natural state of being understood without language. Marin learned things about each of them that the working season had not had time for. She learned that Clem built things in winter the way other people read books, furniture and small repairs and improvements that he had been planning since spring, working in the evenings, with the contented absorption of a man engaged in his primary language. She would sit near the stove and do her accounts, and he would work at the bench he had set up in the corner, and they would not speak for an hour at a time, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling. She learned that Weston slept poorly in winter, not every night, but often enough that she came to recognize something in the quality of the cabin's night quiet on the evenings when he was awake. On those nights, she sometimes heard him moving, going to the kitchen for water, sitting by the banked fire for a while, returning to bed. She did not ask about it, but she started leaving tea in a covered pot near the stove on evenings when she had the feeling, and in the morning the pot was sometimes empty and sometimes not, and she kept doing it either way. She learned that Rowan talked to William, not often, not in a way that would be visible to anyone who was not paying close attention. But sometimes when he was working alone in the barn or walking the fence line at the edge of the property, she would see his lips moving in a way that was not conversation with himself, but conversation with someone specific. And the expression on his face during these moments was the expression of someone making a report to someone who would actually care about the details. She did not mention this to him. She wrote it in her notebook. He is not haunted by William. He is in ongoing relationship with him. These are different things. In February, she wrote to her mother, the first real letter since the brief one she had sent from Greystone Creek in the autumn to say she was staying. She did not describe the winter in detail. She described the ring on her finger, which had been Rowan's mother's. She described the hawk on the mantel, which had been Weston's 3 weeks of evenings. She described the chair on the porch that fit her exactly, which had been Clem's way of saying the thing he had already said, but wanted to say again in a language he trusted more than words. She wrote, "I am the right size for this life, Mama. I did not know that was something a person could be until I found it. Thank you for not stopping me when I left. I think you knew even then that stopping me would have been the wrong kind of kindness." She folded the letter and addressed it, and set it with the outgoing mail, and went back to the accounts she had been keeping, the careful record of a household that was for the first time since the fire took William running, with the kind of ordered efficiency that comes from having enough people who care about it. One evening in January, Rowan came in from the barn and sat at the kitchen table and watched her finish the entries in the household account book, and when she set down the pen, he said, "I want to show you something." He went to the shelf in the hallway where he kept the things he did not know how to display, but could not put away the folded flag from William's service in the militia. a photograph of their mother taken in Kansas before the move west, a hand-drawn map of the property as it had existed when they first arrived, before the years of improvement and expansion had changed its shape. He took down a small wooden box she had not seen opened before. Inside was a ring, simple gold, not thick but not thin, with no ornamentation, the ring of a man who had thought about what he meant by it rather than what it looked like. "This was my mother's," he said. "William kept it after she died. When William died, I kept it." He held it in his scarred hand and looked at it for a moment, with the expression he wore when he was thinking about more than one thing at the same time. "I have been trying to find the right way to give this to you since October. I did not want to do it wrong." She looked at the ring. "You are not second," he said. "You were never second. The arrangement that brought you here was second, but you are not that arrangement. You are what the arrangement became, which is something I did not know to ask for, and would not have had the sense to recognize if it had arrived any other way." He stopped. "I am not good at this." "You are doing fine," she said. He looked up. "You are doing exactly fine," she said. "Give me the ring, Rowan." He placed it on her finger. It fit as though it had been made for it, which it had not been, which meant something about the quality of fit that is not a matter of precise measurement, but of a different kind of correspondence entirely. She looked at it on her hand. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. His expression was the expression of a man who has set down something heavy and is standing up straight for the first time in a while, getting used to the unfamiliar sensation of not carrying it. Clem, from the doorway, where he had apparently arrived at some point during this exchange, said, "I can see that you know. I am standing right here." "Go away, Clem," Rowan said without heat. I'm going," Clem said, and did not go, and when Marin looked at him, he was smiling, the smile that had nothing complicated in it, the smile of a man watching something go right and knowing he was there to see it. Weston appeared behind Clem in the doorway, looked at Marin's hand, looked at her face, and gave one single nod. It contained in the economy of it everything that Weston Cross considered worth saying about this moment, which was that it was right, and that he had known it would be right, and that he was glad to be present for the confirmation. Nash appeared behind Weston and looked over his shoulder and said, "Oh, good. Does this mean we're having something special for supper?" In the late spring, when the snow had retreated to the high peaks and the creek was running clean and strong with the melt, and the cattle were back in the lower pasture on the new grass that came up greener after a hard winter than after an easy one, Marin walked to the creek alone in the early morning. She went there sometimes, not often, just enough to have the quiet of it, the sound of the water, and the smell of the pine, and the mountains sitting against the sky with the patience of things that have been here longer than anything else and will be here long after. She sat on the flat rock that had become her rock by virtue of being the one she had sat on first, and had returned to consistently enough that it now felt like a choice rather than a coincidence. She opened her notebook. It was nearly full. She had started a second one in November, and it was half full too. The entries were different from what she had written in Indiana, different from what she had written in the first weeks here. Less observation and more record, less analysis and more account, the difference between a person studying a place and a person living in one. She did not write anything now, she just held it. She thought about the kitchen in Lafayette and the letter on the table and the stagecoach ticket with her family's name on it. She thought about the 4 days of travel with the mountains appearing on the horizon and growing until they were simply the condition of existence. She thought about stepping off the coach in Greystone Creek and finding 3 men looking for someone else and deciding that this was information rather than verdict. She thought about who she had been then. Not worse exactly, not lesser, but smaller. contained by the dimensions of what other people had decided was the available space for her, the plain one, the useful one, the one who stayed. She was still the one who stayed, but it was different now, the staying. It was chosen rather than defaulted to, elected rather than inherited, the consequence of a decision she had made with her eyes open and had continued making every day since. A sound on the path. She knew the footstep. Weston sat down on the rock beside her, without asking, which he had stopped asking sometime in the fall, the question having been implicitly and permanently answered. They sat for a while in the silence that they had by now established as their primary language for the early morning. Two people for whom quiet is not empty, but full of the particular content of people who have decided to be present in the same place at the same time. "You were writing," he said. "Thinking. What about—" She looked at the creek, at the way the water moved over the stones with the efficiency of something that has figured out the path of least resistance and committed to it without embarrassment. "About what it costs to bet on yourself when no one else is betting," she said, "and what you get back if you're right." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you get back?" She looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at the notebook in her hands. She looked at the mountains which she had been looking at for 14 months now, and had not yet finished understanding, and thought about the hawk on the mantel inside the cabin, that she had moved there from the kitchen, because it belonged somewhere she could see it from the chair where she sat in the evenings. "Everything," she said. "You get back everything." The creek ran past. The mountains sat where they had always sat. The morning light came down through the pine trees with the patient generosity of something that arrives every day, regardless of whether it is expected. From up the hill she heard Nash's voice calling something about breakfast, and Clem's voice answering with the enthusiasm Clem brought to all meals, and after a moment, Rowan's voice, quieter than the others, saying her name. Once the way he said it, now that he had stopped being careful about letting himself say it, the way that meant simply "come home." She stood up and brushed the pine needles off her dress. Weston stood with her. They walked back up the hill together in the early light, and behind them the creek kept running, and the mountains kept standing, and the morning kept arriving the way mornings do in country like this, indifferent to endings, committed only to the persistent fact of beginning.